we all have bad days, but hopefully you haven't had a day as bad as the man who went in for a simple physical and got a call from the doctor a couple days later. The doctor said he had bad news and even worse news. I said, well, give me the bad news first. Well, your tests show that you had 48 hours to live. I was stunned. The man said, that's the bad news? How can there be worse news than that? The doctor paused for a moment, then replied, well, I've been trying to reach you now for 2 days. That's bad luck. That's bad timing. That's bad days. Hopefully we have better than that. But the suffering and struggles and sadness are things that are hardwired into our lives, hardwired into our world today. It's something we all go through at various times and varying degrees. Reminds me of an Army chaplain who had a sign on his door, and it said 2 things. It said, if you have troubles, come in and tell me about them. And if you don't have troubles, come in and tell me how you do it. Because we all have troubles. We all have those times. And we're in a series that we're continuing from way back last year on Genesis. We're finishing it up now. But if you recall, Genesis can be broken into 8 pieces, two different sections, if you will. An event of the events, I should say, were creation, the fall, the flood, and the tower. Going on from there, you have 4 people that it highlights through: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and now we finish up with Joseph, an individual who certainly knows trouble, who certainly knows trials and perils. In 1978, psychiatrist M. Scott Peck published a very popular book called The Road Less Traveled. Now, it's not a Christian book. It does contain some biblical truth, but it also contains some non-biblical truth. But the opening sentence in that book was a 3-word sentence. It just said, life is difficult. And every single one of us listening today, whether online or physically here, can verify that truth. Now, since every one of us is going, or will go through trials in their life, each of us needs to learn how to navigate through them without letting them crush our faith or our hope or our love. And last week, we started a new series within this series of Genesis, and we called it together for that very purpose. And this month's series is called Joseph, Trust Through Our Trials. Throughout this series, we're going to see Joseph go through some really, really tough trials. Bad things happen to good people. You don't have to be in sin to have unexpected things happen from people you did not think would do such things. So Joseph goes from the pasture as a shepherd boy to the pit and to a possession, a slave in a foreign country. Can you imagine anything much worse? He couldn't speak the language. He didn't know the culture or the customs. And now he's the property of a puffed up police officer with a huge house and a wife with way too much time on her. Joseph didn't deserve any of this, but here he is. And what's he going to do? How's he going to handle it? How's he going to let it affect his life and those that are around him? We cannot change our circumstances, but how it affects us, we can and must have some changes in. This is where we might expect Joseph to take a turn for the worse, spiraling into depression and bitterness and debauchery. Instead, what we find is the faithfulness of Joseph. In this series, we'll see that through all of his trials, Joseph learned to trust God overall, his sovereign plan for his own life. And because of his choice to trust God through the trials of his life, Joseph doesn't just survive. He actually ends up thriving. Instead of allowing the struggles he encounters to sour his faith in God, he trusts God through each trial and allows it to deepen his dependence upon God. And here's what Joseph concludes after facing the greatest challenges of his life. Genesis 50, verse 20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. This is the theme verse for our series. I hope through this month of June that you'll take time to memorize it. In case you weren't with us last week, Joseph's trials really began. He was being raised by a fairly dysfunctional family. And as we learned last week, dysfunction unchecked leads to disaster unleashed. And this family came to crisis when Joseph was 17. His father had unwisely shown Joseph over-the-top favoritism over his brothers. And his brothers grew increasingly, understandably, but increasingly jealous. To make matters worse, Joseph arrogantly or naively shared the content of his dreams that indicated that all his brothers, along with his father and his mother, would one day bow down to him and serve him. That maneuver was more than the brothers could handle, and they seriously considered right then and there and plotted how to kill him. But instead, they sold him as a slave to a caravan of Ishmaelites who were on their way to Egypt. And then they led their father Jacob to believe that a wild animal had devoured his favored son. So we pick up the story in chapter 39 of Genesis, Genesis 39, verse 1. When Joseph was taken to Egypt by the Ishmaelite traders, he was purchased by Potiphar, an Egyptian officer. Potiphar was the captain of the guard for the Pharaoh, for the king of Egypt. We learn a little bit more in Psalm 105, verse 17. It says, then he sent someone to Egypt ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with fetters and placed his neck in an iron collar. He was in pain. He was tortured as a slave, but it's about to get even worse. Now, Potiphar was called the captain of the guard for Pharaoh. Some commentators say that he was the captain of the bodyguards for Pharaoh. In either case, Potiphar would have been nobody to fool with. He was a seasoned military man with power over life and death in Pharaoh's administration, and the one who was in charge of the prison. Verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Now, this is a key reference here. We're going to see it several times this morning. One that we shouldn't forget. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded. Joseph's brothers, those closest to him, had attacked him, but an attack is not merely a threat of pain or some kind of abuse. And now an attack was lurking that was even more dangerous than the pit. Right in the middle of his troubles, he would face even more. He was in the will of God, and yet the storm continued on. God is with all of us if we're faithfully following him. James 4:8 says, come close to God, and God will come close to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, for your loyalty is divided between God and the world. See, God's more interested in who you are than what you are. That means you're called to be excellent. Now, notice I didn't say perfect. None of us can be perfect, but we can excel, be the best that we can be with the resources that we have at hand. And we're called to be excellent in our relationship with God. And if we do that, then what will flow is additional excellence in your job, in your marriage, in every part of your life. Verse 3, Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. Apparently, one look at Joseph and a person could see that God was with him. God made all he did to be profitable, even in his storm. God is watching us in all of our storms as well, and will bless our obedience even in those storms. By the way, you don't have to tell someone you're a Christian. They should be able to see it in your life. Know this, when people know that you are a Christian, your life, your words, your actions are constantly on trial. You're a testimony for or against your namesake as a Christian. And that namesake is Jesus Christ. 1 Peter 3:16. Sometime we should do a study together. You know, we all know the famous verse, John 3:16. But interestingly enough, there's some very important 3:16s all through Scripture. And here's one of them, 1 Peter 3:16. But do this, tell others about your faith. Do this in gentle and respectful way. Keep your conscience clear. And then if people speak against you, they will be ashamed when they see what a good life you live because you belong to Christ. See, we're called to be different. We're called by God to follow his word and be an example of Christ living amongst all of us. Verse 4. This pleased Potiphar. So he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. 4 verses. In verse 1, Joseph arrives in Egypt with nothing but his torn clothes on his back. But by the end of verse 4, he's running the whole show for the man who runs the security for the Pharaoh. How do we explain this uncanny ability to overcome his adversities? Simple. The Lord was with Joseph. Verse 5, from the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs ran smoothly, his crops and livestock flourished, so Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food he might eat. Now, you might argue that God simply opened all the right doors and all Joseph had to do was walk through the doors that God had opened. And while there may be some truth to that statement, I would suggest that Joseph also was a success because he demonstrated faithful stewardship of the abilities and skills and talents and gifts that God had entrusted to him. The writer wants us to see that God gave him the ability to fit in, to relate, to speak a foreign language, exercise his administrative gifts, even to find favor in Potiphar's eyes. It wasn't simply a matter of talent and hard work and industriousness. And luck certainly had nothing to do with it. Now, just because the Lord was with Joseph, prospering him, blessing him, it doesn't mean that he never again faced trials or tribulations. In fact, interestingly enough, we find the next first recorded Me Too movement in Scripture. Genesis 39, verse 6 to 9. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come and be with me," she demanded, but Joseph refused. "Look," he told her, "my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against you." Wait a minute, that's not what it says. It would be a great sin against God. Notice that his concern was sinning against God in this situation. See, when we sin, we may hurt others. In fact, we probably will hurt others. But when we sin, we always sin against our God. Even if no one else ever found out, God would know. And Joseph cared more about pleasing God than satisfying his own urges or those of his mistress. Verse 10. She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. What did that mean? Well, when she called, he didn't answer. When she texted, he didn't respond. No Facebook messages or instant messages or anything else. When she entered the room, he would leave it. He avoided her like the poison that she actually was in his life. Joseph could have given in. I mean, if you think about it, why not? His family had rejected him, sold him into slavery. He was far from home. And after all, she was married to his master. And isn't a slave supposed to do whatever his owners demand? Joseph could easily have rationalized several different ways for the few fleeting moments. And isn't that what we often do ourselves? We rationalize things. We all face temptation. The internet provides pornography. A classmate provides a cheat sheet. The bar provides alcohol. The credit card provides us comfort. And we provide the excuses. That's our problem. It won't hurt anybody. No one will find out. It's just this once, and just once won't hurt. But you don't get out of one pit by climbing into another. You don't fix a struggling marriage with an affair, or fix a drug problem with more drugs, a drinking problem with more alcohol, or debt with even more debt. And Joseph understood that. But it gets worse for Joseph. Verse 11. One day, however, no one else was around when he went in to do his work. Here she comes, and she's going to catch him in a very weak moment where there are no witnesses. Verse 12. She came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, "Come, be with me." Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. Here's the stunning thing about Joseph. Though Joseph is powerful, influential, and in charge of everything, pride and success do not blind him to his boundaries and limits. He remains humble, and he recognizes that though he's successfully in charge of everything else that Potiphar owns, he has no right to Potiphar's wife. Bill Gates, the CEO of Microsoft, once said, "Success is a lousy teacher. It seduces people into thinking that they cannot lose." That was not Joseph's problem at all. There are three things that kept Joseph from falling into this temptation. Number one, we already talked about his loyalty to God and to his master. But number two, he doesn't entertain the temptation. He doesn't allow it to fester and to grow inside him. James 1 talks about it. Verse 14, temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions. And when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. So don't be misled, my dear brothers and sisters. And thirdly, he plans ahead and builds intentional strategies. Notice temptation's persistence. Day after day, she seduced him. Joseph had made a decision long before he was put in that situation that he was going to honor his master and his God. He had strategically built into his life hedges and guardrails and off-ramps in an effort to resist her. Here's the thing. If you have not determined that you're going to do the right thing when you're faced with temptation, then when you are, you will not make the right decision. I need to repeat that. If you don't Set for yourself limits, boundaries, hedges, guardrails, and off-ramps. If you don't set for yourself ways out, when you're actually faced with a temptation, you will not make good decisions. You'll be caught up in the moment rather than doing the right thing. Now, daily, she tries to seduce him, but verse 10 tells us he wouldn't even be around her. Then the day came when she gives up on the verbal advances. She grabs him with her hands, and he ran out, leaving his clothes in her hand. One writer said he left his coat behind, but he left with his character. When the enemy tries to trap him, he ran. And according to Apostle Paul, it's the most effective response to sexual temptation. 1 Corinthians 6:18, run from sexual sin. No other sin as so clearly affects the body as this one does. For sexual immorality is a sin against your own body. 2 Timothy 2:20, anything that stimulates youthful lust. Instead, pursue righteous living, faithfulness, love, and peace. Enjoy the companionship of those who call on the Lord with pure hearts. And I would suggest that running from any of these things is also good for any temptation we face. So run, shut off the computer, turn off the TV, walk out on that movie. But if you have to plan ahead and you have to be strategic, Joseph had to be intentional and strategic so that his daily duties did not place him in the same room with Potiphar's wife. And he had to think ahead what he would do when or if temptation were to corner him. These are the kinds of choices and habits we have to be willing to build into our lives in advance, not when it happens, in order to have any hope of resisting temptation in our lives. The writer of Genesis 39 goes on in verse 13. When she saw that she was holding his cloak and he had fled, she called out to her servants. Soon all the men came running. Look, she said, my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. When he heard my scream, he ran outside and got away, but he left his cloak behind with me. Words matter. Something doesn't have to be true to still damage. If someone speaks with the intent of hurting another, God actually hates that. Psalm 101:5 says, I will not tolerate people who slander their neighbors. I will not endure conceit and pride. Going on, verse 16, she kept the cloak with her until her husband came home, and then she told him her story. That Hebrew slave you brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me, she said. But when I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his cloak with me. Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. Now, historians tell us that adultery was punishable by death in Egypt back then, certainly at that level. The fact that he was not executed may indicate that though Potiphar was angry, he also knew his wife, and he still had trust in Joseph. So Joseph was sent to prison rather than being killed. Character. Pastor Andy Stanley says, your accomplishments as a leader will make your name known. Your character will determine what people associate with your name. Although Potiphar was furious, he'd always associated Joseph's name with character and integrity. Integrity is who you are when no one's looking. Integrity is not caring if you get caught because you know you'll be caught doing the right thing. Integrity is a lifestyle. It's not what you say, it's what you do. And that's why do as I say, not as I do, doesn't sit well with younger generations today. They want to see our faith in action. They want us to live what we preach. Don't tell me you love God. Show me you love God. When things are tough, show me your God is worth it by living out his principles. So how do you develop Christian character and integrity? Romans chapter 5, verses 3 and 4 tell us this. We can rejoice, too, when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance. And endurance develops strength of character. And character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. And Joseph did all the right things. He deserved a medal. Instead, he got what? A jail cell. Now, maybe you can identify. The truth is, doing the right thing can be very unpopular at times. We need to remember, especially when we're down and out, that we don't do the right things because it's easy and popular. We do it because it's the right thing to do. 1 Peter 3:14, but even if you suffer for doing what is right, God will reward you for it. So don't worry or be afraid of their threats. Sometimes, though, I think we subtly expect that immediate blessing or favor from God is going to come to us when we do the right thing or stand strong against temptation. But don't be confused by the immediate results of your actions. You may still lose your job, your relationship, your friends. You may still be ridiculed. You may still be overlooked for that job promotion. Verse 21 says, but the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love, and the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. The Lord was with Joseph. It says so right there, and yet he was still in prison. And the chapter closes with these two verses, 22 and 23. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. Did you catch it? There it is again. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. In fact, the writer of this chapter thought it so important, he mentioned it 4 times, twice at the beginning and twice again at the end. The Lord was with Joseph. And you know what? He's with you and he's with me too. Maybe you're wrestling with some kind of adversity or abandonment or abuse. One of the reasons I think God allows bad things to happen is that they often make us more open and available to God. When you hit the rock bottom and you've got no job, no money, no friends, what do you have left but God? You may not be happy with your current path or place in life. The question is this, though. Are you faithful with what God has placed in your hand? Joseph was not merely faithful in the face of temptation. He was faithful in prison, and God was always there with him. Do you know him? Are you right with him? Amazingly, Joseph doesn't whine, or at least not on record. He doesn't whine or complain or get angry with God. Instead of allowing his confusion about the turn of events to drive a wedge between himself and God, he seems to trust God through the trial, in the midst of his trial. Of course, Joseph can't see where this is all going. I'm guessing he held on to those dreams that God had given him. But how he was going to get from here to there had to be a very big confusion for him. But he still trusted God. What might have seemed like an unfortunate detour or a hideous mishap or an evil interruption in Joseph's career path was in fact all a part of how God was shaping and preparing Joseph for the duties, for the responsibilities, for the challenges of his future. Joseph had learned that his life was in God's hand. He had learned to trust God through the trials at the top, and now he was going to learn to trust him through the trials at the bottom. So Joseph goes from the pasture to the pit to a possession to prison. And next week we're going to see what happens to him in prison. But in the meantime, I want to urge you to follow in Joseph's footsteps. Not necessarily literally, because that didn't go very well for him, but follow in his footsteps. No matter what you're going through, remember that the Lord is with you. Practice his presence. Practice purity and integrity, even when no one's looking. And don't worry about being punished for doing the right thing, because in the end, God will reward you for being faithful. God has called you for excellence. Commit your life, your family, your career, your ministry to God, and watch him work in that life. And remember today's lesson. God's favor follows faithfulness. God's favor follows faithfulness. And I got an amen from the back of the room. May this lesson sustain you as you trust him through your temptations and your trials. Maybe today you needed to hear a message that God will continue to help you with the temptations that you struggle with today. That he'll give you the strength and the grace and the mercy if you merely ask. Or maybe you've been living like God isn't watching. Maybe you've made some bad choices and you need to get right with God. I want to invite you to do that today as well. I cannot and I will not say it is easy to rebuild character, because it absolutely is not. That's why we have to protect it as much as we can. But God can forgive and help you rebuild what has been given away, what's been lost. There's consequences for all the things we do, but God is ready to help you if you will but merely ask him. So whether you need to ask him to give you continued strength or you need to ask his forgiveness, know this, that he is here for each and every one of us this morning. Let's pray.